Welcome back to News Talk. I'm Melanie Hastings in for Bruce today. Well, a very historic day in Cuba. As we just saw, President Obama traveling there. He is meeting with President Raul Castro right now, and we will be dipping back into those live pictures as we get them. But this is a very important time for the president, the first time that a sitting U.S. president has visited the communist island nation in 88 years, and the stakes are very high. And here to talk about it is Washington Blade International Editor Michael Lavers. Hey, Michael, good to see you.
Nice to see you again.
Seems like the last time we spoke, you were here to talk about Cuba because you had just come back, right? You had traveled there?
I was there last May covering the LGBT rights movement in Cuba, and obviously that trip took place against the process which we're seeing today with the normalization of relations. And literally as we speak, President Obama is meeting Raul Castro in Havana. So it's a really remarkable moment for folks who have been following this for a long time, and many people who have waited for this moment for decades and decades and decades. So it's a really momentous moment that we're watching.
It certainly is. Yeah. And you know this, you're looking at the pictures and you're looking at it from a first-hand perspective. You probably were visiting a lot of the places that we're seeing on TV in Havana, and Old Town Havana. And so this historic meeting with Raul Castro, put that in perspective for us. Raul Castro was not at the airport yesterday to greet Mr. Obama when he arrived with his family. So how would you characterize their relationship at this point?
It's certainly a very complicated one. We're talking about the normalization of relations more than 50 years after they were severed in 1961 when in the aftermath of the Cuban Revolution. So there's a lot of mistrust between the two countries. There's a lot of animosity, a lot of very complicated and quite frankly, there's a lot of hostility as well. So just the fact that President Obama is in Cuba alone is quite remarkable. The fact that Raul Castro did not greet him at the airport yesterday, I know a lot of people are talking about that. I'm not going to speculate as to why, but certainly it did raise a lot of eyebrows. I know they are obviously meeting as we speak, but yeah, just the fact that the president is on the ground in Cuba is just really remarkable, certainly.
And, I guess it was Donald Trump that made mention of this yesterday. He pointed it out that Raul Castro did meet the Pope at the tarmac, but he was not there to greet the President of the United States. So was this a slap on the face?
It certainly was an interesting moment. I was actually watching the arrival ceremony at home here in D.C. yesterday, and it was really curious to see that normally when a head of state arrives in your country, the president is there to greet you or the head of state. This obviously didn't happen in this case, so it certainly was rather curious. We'll see what they say later on today when they have their press conference in Havana. There's a state dinner tonight between the two presidents in Havana. So it'll be very curious to see if some of the reporters who were down there raised that issue. But yeah, reading Donald Trump's comments certainly was quite an interesting moment yesterday. I know Ted Cruz has also spoken out very strongly against the president going down to Cuba. It's somewhat of a personal issue for him with his family leaving Cuba before he was born. So yeah, it's certainly generating a lot of discussion, a lot of reaction, but certainly the historic nature of this trip is not lost on anybody.
So we saw the president and Raul Castro sitting there with the photo op. We expect that they will go behind closed doors and then really meet. How long will they talk, do you think, and what is on tap?
I understand that they're going to be meeting for quite a long time, and then they're going to have a joint press conference later this afternoon in Havana. I think, there's a lot of things that they need to talk about. Most paramount in my mind is the human rights situation. Even as hours before the president landed in Havana, we had this moment where these dissidents known as the Damas en Blanco, the women in white, were protesting as they do every Sunday after leaving Mass, and they were roundly detained, and the treatment that they received was certainly troubling to a lot of people, and this is indicative of what happens in Cuba when people try to challenge the government publicly, and they were detained and roughed up in many cases, and that was seen throughout the world. So this was happening literally hours before President Obama and his family landed in Havana. So that just highlights the difficulty of the situation, some of these really challenging issues that I hope, and I really do hope, that the president is very forceful in talking about those issues with Raul Castro, because that is a concern that a lot of people still have, and the Cuban people certainly, especially folks with whom I speak in Cuba and here in the U.S., really there is a lot to do on that issue, and I really do hope that that is talked about very directly today.
So, these are some of the rights that we take for granted in this country. Freedom of assembly,
Right.
freedom of speech. I mean, people every day are out there in the National Mall
Right.
voicing their opposition to something or other, and it happens and it goes on. It's just part of everyday life in America, but not so in a communist country. So that is one area where our Congress needs to see improvements before a trade embargo might be lifted.
I think so, and people have this idea that now that the relations between the U.S. and Cuba are quote-unquote normalized, that we're going to have an influx of tourists going to Cuba, that it's just Americans are going to be able to go in there and en masse, and that's certainly not the case. The infrastructure, I think we even talked about this the last time, the infrastructure is nowhere near where it should be in terms of allowing cruise ships to come in, plane loads of Americans to come in, so there's a real need to really improve just the real basic infrastructure. The roads are crumbling. I knew that personally from my drives or from my trip driving around Cuba. The sewer, the water doesn't even work in many cases. So there's real basic needs that need to be met before the country is anywhere near ready to welcome plane loads of American tourists coming to Cuba. So that might be something that they'll also talk about. I know that Starwood Hotels just the other day announced that they're going to be opening a few hotels in Havana.
Or running them.
Right, so that's another step forward. But again, there's a lot of challenges. The government regulations are one, the lack of infrastructure, and just, there's so much that needs to be met in terms of basic needs of the population before we see an influx of tourists come in from the United States.
Fidel Castro ruled the country with an iron fist for some 56 years or something like that. Now his brother is the leader of the country. How has Raul Castro put his stamp on things?
He's made some what I would describe as modest reforms since he took power. For example, Cubans can run their own, rent out their homes for people to stay in them. They're called casa particulares. And
Airbnb?
Something to that. Right,
like
it's kind of
right?
the Cuban equivalent of that, but I know Airbnb is starting to open up in Cuba as well. So there's been some modest reforms, but the big things that need to be changed, including reforming the economy, improving the infrastructure, really haven't changed very much. And one thing that I noticed throughout my time in Cuba last year was that the image of Fidel, both literally and figuratively, is all over the country. There's billboards with his picture everywhere, so he's kind of like the big brother, still looking over every aspect of Cuban life. Kind of his essence and his spirit kind of lingers. So even though Fidel is not in power per se, his presence is still very much there.
Being felt, right.
Absolutely.
What do you think Raul Castro wants from the United States?
That's a very good question, and I think it depends on who you ask. I think, in my mind, the basic thing is that I think he realizes that the economy in Cuba is so bad. The situation is really bad for his country and his people. So I think one incentive for him to normalize relations is to perhaps open up the country and to get much needed capital into the country to start doing these sorts of improvements in terms of infrastructure, things of that sort.
So that will take an infusion of cash.
I think so.
So he's looking for money
yeah.
from the U.S.
Yeah, and you've started to see some small changes in the law, as much as the president can do without, repealing the embargo, which is something that only Congress can do, and that's certainly not going to happen anytime soon.
But would our Congress be likely to send money their way?
I doubt that. I sincerely doubt that, just because there is some, there are some folks in Congress who do actively resist any sort of, rapprochement with Cuba, and they're very vocal about that. And we're also in an election cycle too, so that factors into this as well. So I don't think you're going to see any lifting of the embargo anytime soon. You're going to see, through administrative means, as we've seen with some of these loosening of travel restrictions, you're going to see things like that happen. But I think the embargo is certainly not going to be repealed anytime soon.
And then you've got President Obama in his last year in office. Is he legacy building, and what does he want from Cuba?
There's so many interesting things to raise about this. I think, one thing that he continuously says is that, this policy, which started even before he was born, just did not work. The Castros are still in power. In some ways the embargo only strengthens their hold on power within the country. It's a very convenient excuse for the Castros to use the embargo to deflect attention away from things that are going wrong in their country that they are responsible for. So there's a whole list of things you could look at. I think one thing, it solidifies goes a long way in terms of improving the United States credibility among Latin American countries, certainly, but also around the world, because this policy is extremely unpopular in the region, and it's really, has caused a lot of hardship among the Cuban people who really have no say or control over this, what's happening. So this really goes a long way, I think, in building that goodwill among folks in Latin America, and broadly speaking, around the world as well. So it's certainly a good step for many people, but there are folks who still question the need for, question why this is happening, and really are just outright hostile and critical of it.
Lots more to talk about
Sure.
with this historic day. President Obama right now meeting with Raul Castro in Cuba, and we're back with more News Talk in just a minute.